CyberHub Engage podcast is sponsored by CyberHub Summit, hosting its second annual Cybersecurity Summit in Atlanta, Georgia on October 10th, 2018, featuring a live tabletop exercise with audience participation, global speakers, engaging topics. Experience cyber different at www.cyberhubsummit.com. Hey everyone, welcome to the CyberHub Engage podcast. Thanks for tuning in. I'm James Azar and I'm your host, and I'm on the road again, and this time I'm in Buckhead, Georgia at Baker Donelson with the amazing and awesome Justin Daniels. What's happening, brother?
Not too much, man. It's good to be with you today.
It's good to be here too, and it's an awesome day in Atlanta. It's nice outside.
It is. We're in the middle of summer, and fall is fast approaching, which is one of the best
school
times.
is back.
For me, next week it is.
Really?
Yes.
Your kids aren't back to school yet?
I get a reprieve till next week.
Oh, man. Everyone else I've spoken to, kids are back to school this week. They're like, life has gone back to normalcy. I mean, everyone else listening on the East Coast and everywhere else in the world is looking at us like we're weird. We start school first week of August, but, you know, it is what it is. Justin, you're one of the partners at Baker Donelson. You're also the founder of Cybercon, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but you're in cybersecurity law. Kind of. Tell us about that path.
Sure. So my involvement in cybersecurity dates to November of 2014. That was the month that two things happened. One, I hosted a famous Israeli entrepreneur named Zohar Zissafel, who was in Atlanta for one entire day to talk about his latest venture, which was the connected car and cybersecurity. Spent a day with them, and he leaves, and he says, you know what? You have an amazing ecosystem here in Atlanta, and you should think about getting the word out, and companies would probably really be interested. That same month, I was working on a project with a client with Sony, and that was the month the North Koreans decided to pay them a visit. And so from those two seemingly random events, an idea crystallized in my head is who's helping the community really unite around the idea that cybersecurity is very important, and not only that, but our region has a real role to play if we can speak with a unified voice. And from that, I started down this path. So you deal with different cybersecurity law in itself is, I think, non-existent to the most part. I mean, people confuse privacy like GDPR with cybersecurity. That's compliance and privacy. There's a difference between privacy and security, although security plays a point in protecting privacy, but it's not the same. Yep. Has there been anything that has really baffled you in terms of trying to, I want to say, not regulate cyber, but just court rulings or lawsuits or things that have gone on that have, are kind of, I don't want to say primitive because I think that's too out there, but just surprising or show a lack of understanding of the challenge in security in general? So, James, I think the way that I'm going to try to answer your question is when I do a lot of speaking, I talk about the topic of innovation. And what I mean by that is you and I are going to talk about blockchain. We may talk about AI. We'll talk about a bunch of different innovations that have cybersecurity implications. But the thing is innovation now is happening so fast that it's started to overwhelm our ability to assess its long-term consequences. And where I'm heading with that statement is when you look at laws, when you look at our political system and how we deal with things, innovation has kind of swamped our existing institutions' ability to figure out how do we deal with all this. And I think what you're seeing as we drill it into cybersecurity is people are trying to get their head around the problem, and the law and regimes for dealing with it are trailing far behind the evolution of what's going on in cyber. And I think when you ask me, well, is there a specific court case or whatnot, I would tell you it's the overall general trend of this inflection point where
all of this innovation is now overwhelmed our capacity as a legal system, as a political system, to keep up and figure out how we create laws, how we find economic frameworks to properly address cybersecurity.
There's this common misunderstanding of the difference between privacy and security regulation, right? I mean, we see that with GDPR. GDPR prompted companies to, I don't want to say employ specific cyber strategy, but add different roles, use methods to secure data that are a little, kind of give a little bit more liability to the company. But in your discussions with CISOs and leadership, is privacy and regulation still leading to security talk, or are you seeing that start to shift?
Well, why don't we start, and you may have done this before, but when we talk about privacy, we're really talking about how people collect, use, and share your personal data, from your email to things about you. When we talk about security, we talk about how we protect that data from someone getting unauthorized access to it and then taking it away. So there is some overlap, but they are two separate and distinct concepts. And I think the challenge that we have when we talk to CISOs, and I know you were recently in D.C. To talk to some of the folks in Congress, is we don't have any real uniform federal laws that deal with cybersecurity. And now they've passed this California ballot initiative that deals with privacy. And what I think is going to happen is you're going to start to see some of that going on with cybersecurity, because from a CISO perspective, they're charged with protecting the most important and valuable assets a company has. It usually is either their IP, could be customer data. And I don't know that we're going to be able to continue to have all of these breaches that we read about without some type of response. And as much as I would like to say there are market-based solutions that people will embrace, I typically post them on my LinkedIn when I think of them. I think we're going to end up with increased regulation, because I have my doubts that companies are going to truly understand what they need to deal with cyber unless it's not imposed upon them, and GDPR is a good example of that.
Indeed. I mean, you bring up a very valid point, which is you're starting to see that privacy kind of dictates security. It becomes a checkbox on a board and an executive list of things to accomplish so that they're in compliance. You're in one of my previous episodes, we spoke about the responsibility of everyone in the organization towards security. And that starts not just the CISO, but that's the CIO, the CEO, the COO, the CFO, the legal counsel, and so many other individuals. Do you see that? Do you see that kind of happening, or is it still not? Is it mostly resting on the CISO's shoulders?
So the way I'm going to answer that question is, if you think about it, most organizations, they don't even have a CISO. I had dinner last night talking to someone, discussing this with a $100 million company, asking very basic security questions like, what are you trying to protect? Are you trying to protect your reputation, the data of your customers? And they didn't have good answers to that. And so where I come on this is, I think a lot of business leaders would rather not know about their security problems, because if something bad happens, they have a veneer of plausible deniability. Now, it's obviously much harder in an organization where you have a CISO, but as you and I can talk about, then you start to get into an issue of, well, how does the CISO report into the C-suite? As we've seen with some of the breaches that have happened here in Atlanta, a lot of times the CISO doesn't have a direct reporting obligation to the board. They go through maybe the CIO or the CFO, who may have competing priorities, where security is just one of their responsibilities. And the way our economy is going, with our complete reliance on technology, the best practice, in my view, is cybersecurity needs to be its own reporting function into the C-suite and the board, and that's not always the case. So my answer to your question is, I still feel there's a lot that needs to be done on the education front so that leaders in industry understand that cybersecurity is not an IT problem. It is an enterprise-wide business risk, and that's why Atlanta Cyber Week, which we'll talk about, that is one of our main themes.
You know, lawyers in Atlanta don't exactly mesh for most people. When they think of attorneys, they think of the big offices in New York and LA and Chicago and Boston. You essentially lead cyber law, I think, not just in Atlanta, but the Southeast region. Do you feel like there's a shortage of legal professionals in this region to address cybersecurity? Legal professionals who understand cyber the way you do?
Well, I think the answer to that question is I don't position myself as only a cybersecurity lawyer. I am a corporate lawyer by trade, and what I have done is I've gotten a deep knowledge of cybersecurity, because if you want to advise someone at a strategic level about cybersecurity, when I do M&A deals or I do other company work, I get to know the management team on a very strategic level. And so I try to come at something like cybersecurity from, okay, how do we strategically need to deal with cyber in the different areas of organization? Because it permeates everything from your customer contracts to cyber insurance to your M&A deals to people who may invest in your company. And so as opposed to coming at it from saying that I'm a cybersecurity lawyer with just that narrow expertise who may not have a wider purview of how it impacts the company, I try to come from a very strategic perspective, because my background is as a corporate lawyer and M&A attorney, and say, okay, if I'm going to put my business hat on, how does cybersecurity really impact the company? Because I look at cyber as I'm here to help consult with you and understand this strategically. And oh, by the way, I come with the benefit of a legal background where I can think through complications, I can think through consequences, and I try to approach it that way, which is what I found is very different than when you hire a data privacy lawyer or someone who says, I just do cybersecurity, because they don't necessarily come with this wider purview of how cyber impacts the organization in all these different areas.
That's a very valid point. I think that's probably why you're number one in your field, is because you have that point of view and not a different one. But, you've attended a lot of different cyber events this year. We were together at RSA. Unfortunately, I had to miss InfoSec in London, but you went there, and you've gone to a few others, and so have I. What are some common things that people are talking about, but they're not really relevant to the discussion? Those are kind of topics that are missing the point of addressing the real challenges in InfoSec and helping the CISO get his job done right.
Well, one that you and I have talked about is when I've been at conferences, like when you go to, they had one down here, FinTech South, and you had Consensus, and you go there and they talk about financial technology, or they're talking about blockchain, and everybody is sitting there cheerleading, oh, this is a great technology, this does this, or this. But then you go to a more cybersecurity focused conference, or you talk to people who look at things from a security perspective, and what they say is, blockchain is an interesting technology, but they're still working through some of the security aspects. Same goes for fintech. And so what I notice is a very big disconnect between the business people or the technologists who want to shout from the rooftops about the latest technology, and then you have the security professionals who say, well, that's interesting, but what about some of these security aspects? Because as I love to tell people, security just doesn't have a seat at the table when it comes to new technology. It's an afterthought.
I think that's in some of the innovation hubs I've been to over the last few weeks. I've noticed a shift when it comes to security. I'm noticing more startups actually, when I get there, coming up to me going, hey, we realize we got to address security at one point or another. How do we squeeze it into our tight startup budget? What's the the little, I guess they want to call them the cheap hacks that they can use in security to kind of move up and kind of do different things, and so you're starting to see kind of that switch taking place in some innovation, but you're right, it's still not unfortunately a thought for a lot of different companies. It's innovation, people come in and they want to cheer on new technology, but they're not really focused on how do you make sure that this technology is sustainable.
I would agree with that.
And all it takes is for, I mean, you see that with cryptocurrency. I think part of the reason that, Bitcoins and Ethereums and a lot of different cryptos, the market has kind of died off for it is you had like, I think, what was it? Over $2 billion worth of, hacks of crypto wallets of big exchanges happen in the last 6 months. It's $2 billion worth of cryptos that have been taken from different companies. So you think if $2 billion disappeared off of any publicly traded company, what would happen to that stock?
The CEO would get a raise.
You mean he'd get the $90 million dollar payout?
You said it, not me.
I mean, that's the challenge. And you and I have kind of a passion for blockchain, and it's a very interesting topic because blockchain has great potential, but it's nowhere near ready for mainstream placement yet.
I would agree with that. And to me, it's interesting where when I was at Consensus, if I had a toothache, they had a blockchain solution for it.
For your toothache?
Yes. If I had told someone that.
What was the when you were at Consensus? What was one of the what was the one piece of innovation that you saw that you went, that's kind of interesting, different from all the crypto insurance kind of stuff that's out there today?
There were two of them. One was the machine that could use a blockchain to verify you over 21, and then you could get a beer from the vending machine. That was Civic.
That's a beer vending machine.
Yeah.
I
thought it was pretty good.
That is really, really cool. That's a cool idea, right?
The idea behind it was to use the blockchain for your identity, and it could verify that you're of age so that you could get a beer.
All right. Promoting delinquency to a minor, we'll
Yes.
kind of skip that piece right there.
And then the other one I liked was another technology I saw using blockchain that would allow you to do a peer-to-peer investment in companies, kind of like a competitor to the typical venture funding. And they were using a token that you could do to put in different portfolios of funds, and I thought that was kind of interesting because to me that would be potentially disruptive to the traditional venture capital model.
Didn't the ICOs kind of already disrupt that model for the most part? I mean, today every company does an ICO, launch a token, utility-based or security-based, doesn't matter, and they try to raise money that way, and that's no different than peer-to-peer funding. So, I mean, do you think venture capital is dead because of blockchain?
I guess what I would say is the potential impact of blockchain, its number one value proposition, in my opinion, is it's the idea of getting rid of the middleman. Think of any marketplace that has a middleman. So when you talk about startups or companies who are looking for investment, venture capital is a middleman because you take investors who have money who then, instead of doing it directly, wish to put it into a venture capital fund. So whenever I think of industries that have middlemen, when I think of real estate, when I think of, candidly, when I think of lawyers and smart contracts, I think of all those things as being potential things that get disrupted. However, like with smart contracts, I don't think you're going to be able to do an M&A deal using a smart contract. But in order to do a deal where you're going to escrow money on a real estate transaction, blockchain is potentially a very good solution for that.
Do you feel like this whole concept of getting rid of the middleman in blockchain, I kind of find it hypocritical, and I'll tell you why.
Okay.
There's a lot of the blockchain services that are out there today involve being a middleman, just a new middleman between a consumer and a company. So the company that does the peer-to-peer kind of beating the venture fund, they're the middleman between the company that's trying to raise money and the consumer who wants to give them money because they believe in the product. No different than Kickstarter or anything else out there. And so And so you know, I think trying to get rid of the middleman, I feel like this is kind of, it's a fad in blockchain. I think it's something they say because it sounds good, but really you're not getting rid of the middleman. You're just
Replacing them.
you're replacing the middleman. You're replacing a traditional middleman with someone who may have a better solution.
Well, I guess that's interesting because, I was just out in Seattle visiting a friend who works for Amazon. And so, using your example, I'm going to apply it to Amazon and look what it's done to the brick and mortar retailers. And it's still capturing a small percentage, but look what it's done to those folks who used to be the distribution channel for a lot of products, services, and whatnot. Now you can use Amazon, and now what's happened to the cost?
I'm gonna challenge you on that one for a second. I think you and I are gonna have a debate here for a minute.
Let's have a debate.
I didn't mean to just take away from the middlemen in blockchain.
Okay.
Because, there's a slide going on, and it makes a lot of sense for people who understand it. Uber didn't kill taxis. The taxi industry made Uber better, made Uber a more attractive choice because they gave you more options. They let you do it easier, and you had better control of cost, right? So the yellow cabs, when they protest and say, oh, Uber's taking our, well, look at the company that you work for and be like, hey, develop an app, allow people to use that app and order us, and set straight fares through the app, and more people would use us. I mean, that's what happened in Germany. Uber came into Germany, was then outlawed. Then all the cab companies went and developed a Uber model, and now they let Uber back in. But they've made it they tried to even the playing field for the existing industry.
Okay.
These middlemen that are coming in now and are innovating. Amazon didn't take brick and mortar retail out of business. Brick and mortar retail just didn't innovate, didn't try to upgrade someone's shopping experience, didn't think that going online for their own products, trying to make life easier for a consumer, wanted the consumer to come in and walk around because it upped their bottom line. And consumers were like, but all I wanted was one thing, and I walk away with 5. And Amazon, I can go and just get one thing and get it home.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, is it really Amazon that's, the bad guy here? Or is it, just complacency of success that makes people kind of lack innovation?
Or you could also say, using your Germany example, what role has government intervention, now we're getting into trade policy, played in that? Because looking back at the U.S. automotive industry and how the Japanese came in and out and started to innovate and changed the tenor of the car industry. So I acknowledge what you're saying, because when we bring it back to blockchain, you have the middleman, but then you also have other things like transparency, and depending on how it's done, you have a level of security, because one way to look at security is when you centralize something, and I think of Fort Knox as a great example. You got a whole bunch of gold bars in there, or like an Equifax. You got a treasure trove of data in a centralized place. That's something that's a huge bullseye for a hacker. But if you then have a blockchain where you decentralize something so that's not so centralized, and you use encryption or other kinds of things, then that's a very different way about going about your security architecture. But I will also say the challenge, and you alluded to it. Well, blockchain technology may have some good security features. Well, the technology around it, like some of the wallets that are taken or whatnot, you're only as good as your weakest link in technology. And
considering you're a chain.
Yes, very appropriate. The weakest link in your blockchain.
The weakest link in your blockchain is typically your security wallet key, which is the most important chain.
Yeah.
It's the master key. It's
And now people are putting it in their safety deposit box. So it's all this technology and digitization going right back to
being traditional. Oh, we now we put everything in cold storage, and you're like, doesn't that defeat the purpose of the blockchain?
But to your other point, the blockchain is technologies that are being created around the blockchain are that weak link in that chain, requiring people to take additional action to try to mitigate the risk from those digital wallets.
In the world of cryptography,
Yeah,
we used to, there's a saying that goes along the lines of, the more complex, the easier it is to hack, right? And if we're on the blockchain topic, how many of these blockchain companies have CISOs? None.
Yeah.
How many CISOs actually understand cryptography and blockchain enough to secure it?
not many.
Very few.
Yes.
Right. So there's, like you said, and you alluded to very early in the podcast, hey, we've got all this great innovation. Government can't keep up with it to begin with, but we don't even have the right talent. So we've got all these great ideas, all these people, messing with technology, trying to create something great. But again, we're overlooking that security piece, which, I alluded to Germany, but China has, cyber and blockchain regulation in place, Korea, Russia, a lot of different places where we don't understand it. It's illegal until we do. But we don't do that here. Do you feel like that's an advantage in our innovation, or you feel like that's just the market outpacing government and government being slow to react on it?
I would tend to think we have entered a period where innovation now happens so fast, it has outstripped our ability to comprehend its consequences, and that goes for our political system, and it also goes for our legal system. So I would tend to think what you said has to do with our government is slow to react. And the other thing I would say is the United States, we're a reactive people. Once we get our stuff straight, we react quickly. But we're reactive. Like, look at GDPR. I happened to be over there when it went into implementation. Say what you want about it, and no law is perfect, but it really got companies to think hard about, where is my data? Where is it located? Because these are all very basic questions you have to ask when it comes to security, because security is protecting a lot of times that data. But the EU didn't have a gun to their proverbial head. And what I mean by that is, and I do presentations like you do, is think back to the Depression. Think back to 9/11. Think back to more recently 2008. All of those were very significant events in our country's history. The result were laws that were intended to react to those significant events.
Avoid so it doesn't happen again.
Right, and they were reacting. GDPR is they were being, proactive.
You don't think it was reaction to all the hacks and all the PII information leaking out of Europe?
There may have been a role of that, but I will also say, and you've traveled the world as much or more than I have, is the culture in Europe about privacy and security is very different than the U.S.
For the most part.
And I think that culture obviously infuses their leaders with how they view all of this. In their country, the default is, you don't get my data unless I say okay. In our country, the default is, you get my data, and if you want to opt out, go through 3 or 4 different web pages, and you can find the button that's the 11th one down after you've spent a minute and a half that no one wants to spend trying to find it.
Well, but we kind of self-regulated at opt-outs, right? Yahoo and Google and all these different email servers kind of came out and said, hey, you guys are spamming too much. We're going to build a dedicated spam folder. And that was kind of almost self-regulated, where now, the unsubscribe button has to be on the footer of the email, and it's got to be a one-page kind of deal. And to opt out, otherwise you end up in the spam anyway, so your delivery goes kaput. But we didn't need the government to intervene on that piece. That was industry essentially saying, hey, user experience is not good.
And then another argument you could make would be PCI compliance. But then what I would also say is, I look at the breaches, look at Target, look at Equifax, look at Anthem, City of Atlanta. And I'm just naming the ones that are, in and around where you and I live. What consequences were there for companies or organizations that have these breaches?
None.
Correct.
I mean, stock price went down slightly. Some people lost their jobs, but for all, Target's still in business. Equifax still in business. Stock price back to where it was pre-breach, even higher now.
Right. And what happens if you're a mid-size or a smaller company?
You're done.
Within 6 months, what is it? I think the statistics, 70%. Put a fork in it.
Yeah.
So then the question becomes, and I'm always trying to think of market-based solutions, is what do you do for companies who don't have the budgets of an Equifax or these other companies who can't afford to spend the same amounts of money? If you have regulation, who typically gets hurt the most about regulation? And I saw this with GDPR. You need a lot of resources to comply with GDPR. So who got an inherent competitive advantage right after
Google,
this passed?
Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, you name it. The big boys are the ones that now rule the marketing world in Europe.
You got it.
The same people who the EU was trying to regulate ended up winning big time.
I would agree with you on that. So I don't have a perfect solution, but I think we need to be having this debate. Like, for example, I do when I do speaking engagements, the best example of artificial intelligence I can think of is The Terminator. And the movie came out in 1984. And it seemed like it was science fiction. I would tell you in 2018, it's now terrifyingly realistic. And, you know, nobody's really talking about it. I remember last year during Atlanta Cyber Week, there was somebody, an executive for a company, I'll leave him nameless, who said, I think Elon Musk is jumping the gun in saying we should regulate AI because it's too far down the pike. And I thought about that for a minute. In 2007, in September, that's when Facebook became available to anybody over the age of 13 with an email account. Here we are, less than 10 years later, and Facebook and Twitter have completely revolutionized the way that we get our basic facts. And that was less than 10 years. So when I hear executives talk that way, I'm thinking you don't fully appreciate how fast things are going.
You make a valid point, and speaking of Atlanta Cyber Week,
Yeah.
let's talk about this great week coming up in a few months that has us all gray-haired and sleepless at night.
Yep.
Because it is a great little thing, and you are you actually initiated Atlanta Cyber Week, so you kind of started talking about that Israeli guy that came here for that day. Was that the birth of Atlanta Cyber Week? The birth of the idea, maybe?
Well, I would say Cyber Week is more of an evolutionary process. And what I mean by that is when I first started, I was like, okay, we're going to Israel next year on a trip. What do we do to get them to want to come back? Oh, we'll have a conference. And at that conference, let's not do it the traditional way. Who do international folks really want to meet? CISOs, what is Atlanta great at? We have a great customer base down here, so maybe we can facilitate business. So that was that evolution of the idea. So once we did that well for a couple years, it's like, okay, we have this whole community in the region. And I know you've talked about to different people about it. And how do we get Cyber Command and Augusta involved? How do we get Georgia Tech involved, the universities, and all these other pillars that make this region a great cybersecurity ecosystem? Well, if you want to do that, it can't be just about one event, and it can't be just about one person. So that's when we said we need to have an entire week. And we need to have events that are sponsored by all the different people in the community who care. And don't want to tell people how to run their event. They need to come within a broad umbrella of the themes that we're trying to promote. And that's how we evolved to Cyber Week. And last year we had 10 to 12 events. We'll have probably something similar or more. And this gives our entire community the opportunity to speak with one voice, because that's one of the challenges that we've had, and you and I have talked about it, is how do we get people to overcome their parochial agendas and say, as a region, we need to speak with one voice about why cybersecurity is so important, but also why this region has a real opportunity to play a significant role in how this industry is shaped. And can't tell you how much I appreciate the partnership of you and Corinne and being yet another terrific event to anchor the week besides Cybercon, because we're just past the point where this is about one person or about one event. It's got to be a collective, community-wide effort.
I've spoken to a lot of people, and the one thing, our listener base on the podcast isn't just Atlanta. We've been blessed to have people from all over the country and parts of the different countries in the world. I was surprised to get our analytics a few days ago and see where people are listening from. So thank you. For those who've maybe been here before, you kind of indicated that this year is very different. What's different from this year from all the years before for Atlanta Cyber Week?
So for Atlanta Cyber Week, this is our second year doing the week, but, we've been at this for 4 years now. Is the theme of this year is really how do we educate the C-suite, board of directors, and business owners that cybersecurity is not an IT problem. It is a business enterprise risk that needs to be treated that way at the C level. And that is the theme throughout our week, from what we're doing at Cybercon, for what we're doing at Cyber Hub Summit, to a lesser extent at other events. But if I had to have one overarching theme of what we're really focusing on this year, it's really that, because we can talk about cybersecurity, but in terms of business, if you don't have the C-suite and the leadership identify that this is a priority of an organization, you can't expect employees to start making it a priority unless management does. And this is our way of trying to really bring a spotlight on that.
I kind of want to point something out to those listening. Shameless promotion. You guys who listen know I try not to do these often, but given that you set me up for it, I just want to say that between both events, we have more people speaking who actually operationalize cyber than I think any other conference in the industry. And what I mean by that is there's less people selling and more people who actually do the work talking between Cybercon and Cyber Hub Summit this year than I think every conference I look at, you typically see, and no disrespect to vendors, because vendors are great and they're a crucial part of the ecosystem. But a lot of times, you go to a conference and you're listening to vendors argue about who has the better solution rather than addressing the problem. And I think for a lot of people, this year at Atlanta Cyber Week, you're going to hear from people who actually operationalize and are in the cyber trenches, as we like to say, fighting that fight, talking about it on panels and in keynotes and through different exercises. And I think that's an advantage altogether. If you're a business owner, if you're an executive, that is your opportunity to come and listen to what other people are going through, so that maybe you can also realize some of the challenges that your CISO goes through on a daily basis.
I would add that this is all about getting practical, actionable advice that can actually improve your organization's cyber posture, because if they want in, they're going to get in. Security is not a destination, it's a journey. But there's a whole host of pretty simple things that you can do to go from a 20% posture up to about an 80 or 85%. And a lot of companies don't want to acknowledge that or think through what are some of the real simple things that can be done with access management and your inbox. They're there to be had. You just have to open your ears and want to listen. And that's really what we're going to try to accomplish this week, exactly what you said.
There's a slew of content going on, and atlcyberweek.com is the website where you can get more information. And what I've said on previous episodes where we've talked about Atlanta Cyber Week, if you want to attend more than one event, you can drop us a line, and we'll try to arrange to get you a reasonably priced pass for all events. If you're if you're coming from out of town and trying to spend the whole week here. So you can just email CyberHub Engage through our Facebook page, Twitter, or LinkedIn, and we'll be glad to assist in getting you into all the relevant events
that you want to be a part of during the course of this week, because it's going to be awesome. It's the week of October 8th. Cybercon's October 9th at the Georgia Learning Center, correct?
That is correct.
And Cyber Hub Summit is the following day at the City Winery in Pond City Market in Atlanta. I want to ask you kind of this question, and I feel like it's something that, you know, can kind of be our wrapping point, I'd like to say. But
Sure.
We talked about having more CISOs and more people who operationalize cyber speak at Atlanta Cyber Week this year. Where do you feel organizations missed the point in incorporating the CISO as part of their discussion?
I think it happens in a couple areas. One, how the CISO reports up through the organization that I talked about before. But I think the other one is, and this is where I think CISOs need to be thinking about how to improve their skill set, is a lot of CISOs are very technically proficient folks. But when you have to translate cyber from its technical aspects into a business case so that the C-suite can understand it, be informed about it, and make good business decisions considering it, I think a lot of times things can get lost in the translation and how CISOs go about communicating. So to me, that's not a cybersecurity problem. That is a let's help people refine their skill set and how they speak about cyber in a way that their audience understands, because I'm sure you've been to conferences as I have, and you're watching somebody up there who has brilliant credentials and can't explain anything in reasonable terms to save their lives, and that's a critically important skill when it comes to this cybersecurity stuff.
You're right. I mean, nothing I can add to that.
Drop the mic.
Drop the mic right now. Just no. There's, I think that one of the bigger challenges in incorporating CISOs is, I think it comes by industry. Because when you and I speak to our CISO peers in the financial services or banking sector, they're very well informed. They're very much in tune with their boards, their C-suite leadership. There's a little bit more of an attention to them there, because after all, their job is money, and money is no longer paper that you pick up at the bank. It's on your credit card and online. And when was the last time someone really carried a big amount of cash in their pocket?
And what else do they have in the banking industry?
PII.
And regulation.
Again, it's money, so people had to regulate that fast.
Right.
But in other industries, we're seeing that to be kind of a slow evolution. And that's where I think when you look at the challenge in security today in general, you really have to look at it by industry at this point. Because if you're trying to preach, oh, well, you don't report to your board, you go talk to a CISO of a Wells Fargo or a Chase or any medium-sized bank, they look at you and be like, dude, what are you talking about? I sit with my CEO once a month, and I'm in front of my board every 3 months, and I get 15 minutes. That typically takes half an hour or 45 minutes because they have more questions. They want to get more information. And
how about this, Jay? Let me ask you this question. So I was at an event with Metro for the National Association of Corporate Directors, NACD. Someone asked a question. How many of you in here have an audit committee dedicated to cyber? Meaning, board of directors will have specified committees that deal with issues. Out of 30, how many?
1.
You were off by 50%. 2. And board of directors, at the end of the day, for publicly traded companies, those are the stewards of the corporation. And you and I are talking about all these issues on this podcast in 2018, but yet I can go to an event like that with people who are charged with being stewards of very large corporations, 2 out of 30. So to me, that perfectly encapsulates the yawning gap that we still have in educating our C-suite, our board, about cyber.
But I want to kind of go to my point. How many of those that raised their hand, what industry were they from? Were you able to identify? Were they identified at all?
It wasn't industry specific, but I will say you are right. When it comes to cybersecurity, financial services is really out in front. When you talk about ISACs, which are the information sharing and analysis centers, financial services is leading the way. And you're right, part of that is due to money. But then I look at healthcare and HIPAA, you know, we still struggle in that. And I won't even, you know, we could have our own podcast on the issues in healthcare. And then I was having dinner last night with someone who's very well versed in cyber, and they're like, how do we deal with, you know, biometrics and, you know, the gene pool if people are able to hack into that? And I hadn't even thought much around that. And that's what's coming down the pike. I mean, there is no industry, there is nothing when you digitize and use technology where cybersecurity is not an issue.
Yes. And, you know, you and I can probably go on for another hour, but then we'd end up having a Tim Ferriss kind of podcast where it just doesn't end. And I love Tim, and he's a great guy, and who's helped me kind of start this podcast with some really cool tips. So, and I told him, I was like, man, I don't know how you do those 3-hour podcasts, but I love it. I mean, there's some of them that are very interesting for like 3 hours, and others where after 10 minutes you kind of tune away, and he knows that, but still, it's still a fun conversation. But I will have Justin on again, I think, right before Cyber Week. We'll be talking about the final agenda and whatnot, and what's going on and what's happening. And we'll probably bring on Jorge so he can talk about the party and everything else, that the Metro Chamber, all the free beer that you're going to get from the Metro Atlanta Chamber. So when Jorge hears this, he just knows I offered free beer from the Metro Atlanta Chamber. And if you have any issues with getting that free beer, just find Jorge Fernandez and send him a message. Either way, Justin, thanks for being on, man. I really appreciate it.
Appreciate your partnership. Happy to be here.
Awesome. This is the Cyber Hub Engage podcast. We'll be right back after these messages. The Cyber Hub Engage podcast is sponsored by Cyber Hub Summit, hosting its second annual Cybersecurity Summit in Atlanta, Georgia on October 10th, 2018, featuring a live tabletop exercise with audience participation, global speakers, engaging topics. Experience cyber different at www.cyberhubsummit.com.